Chapter 3. Cohen. Amidst the deafening roar of the flames, the creaking structure cried out, warning of its imminent failure. But every direction Cohen turned, fire leapt to impede his escape, like a predator toying with its prey. Oxygen thinned with every breath, and the unnatural heat felt like it was cooking him from the inside. There was no escape, nothing to do but watch as fire swept across the ceiling like a rushing wave. 2 dark spots began forming inside the flames, and then an elongated third beneath. It was a face. For a split second, the unexpected image was a distraction from an impending doom. When he heard it, Cohen! Piercing through the deafening roar and creaking structure, something cried out his name. It sounded like it came directly from the fire. A further hesitation, just long enough for the flaming mouth to open and the gaping darkness descended, engulfing him into an abyss. Cohen gasped for air as he woke, pawing at his chest for something that wasn't there, as if the nightmare tried following him into the day, the smell of burning flesh lingering in his nostrils. While he was unable to recall details, he knew unequivocally the burning flesh was his own. He was still wearing filthy jeans and a t-shirt soaked with sweat, as were the Egyptian cotton sheets he was laying on. It had become more commonplace in recent months to wake up in clothes from previous days, with an alcoholic blackout of the last 12 to 24 hours. However, he was surprised on this rare occasion to have made it to his own bed. Snatching up a bottle of water from the bedside table, pain instantly coursed through his body, causing him to knock over an empty bottle of Johnny Walker Blue. It bounced harshly onto the floor, skipping across the wooden surface without smashing. He gulped back the water, desperately trying to quench the dehydration that had become a daily pattern of abuse, and until just now, successfully suppressed the plaguing nightmares that questioned his sanity. Now they were back. It wasn't night terrors that had become the undoing of a once disciplined operator. It was their timing. While on a contract in Europe, Cohen experienced an event that threw into question everything he had come to believe. The nightmares followed soon after. He couldn't comprehend how a man with no fealty, no faith, who held no stock in fate, suddenly felt as though he was on a collision course with destiny. The nightmares, he believed, were haunting glimpses into the future, premonitions. Now not even the alcohol could keep them at bay. A part of him was still trying to convince himself he was simply losing his mind. But what he truly believed, and what he'd never voiced, was that he had experienced God, and God had turned his back on him. Cohen suddenly noticed his favourite trusty leather boots sitting curiously neat on the other side of the room, socks balled up and stuffed into the openings. He was very much awake, but not entirely present. The spent water bottle slipped from his fingers and fell to the floor. There was a faint taste of blood in his mouth, and his jaw pained with a stiffness and swelling. But it was the boots that continued to hold his attention, neatly side by side. Not the actions of a blacked-out drunk, he thought. Swinging his legs over the side of the bed, he winced, the movement revealing further injury. Placing his hand on his rib cage, he inhaled carefully, expanding his lungs until feeling a sharp pain, suggesting he'd either cracked or broken some. Following a spotted trail of blood from his jeans onto his dark t-shirt, spots increased to blots and patches, all probably his own, and no memory to explain how they got there. A noise from the shop below snapped him into the present. Nathan must have arrived and started setting up for the day. Looking at the old-fashioned clock on his bedside table, the type you had to wind, it was nearly 6:30. You could set your watch to Nathan's timekeeping, and he didn't arrive at the shop until 6:55 a.m. sharp. A sudden shameful image flashed through his mind, of Nathan finding him passed out drunk and having to get him home. That would explain the boots and socks, and for him being at the shop so early. He was sure Nathan could do without him getting under his feet, probably not having been the most pleasant person to be around in recent times, but he did own the shop, and if the alcohol wasn't working, then keeping busy was the safest distraction. First, he would have to get rid of the ripe smell of sweat and alcohol oozing from his pores. After a hot shower, a pint of water and 4 strong painkillers, Cohen donned fresh jeans, a loose charcoal V-neck t-shirt that flowed softly against his skin, and of course his favourite trusty leather boots that he left to sag with the laces untied. He scraped the long strands of damp hair from his face and tied them behind his head with an elastic band. He then headed downstairs to his shop, the Way of the Flower. Situated opposite the old arches south of the River Thames, Independent businesses were quite rare this close to the city. Rent was expensive, and now it seemed only franchises left their generic mark on the high streets. But Cohen managed to snap up the 3-story building some years back as a repossessed freehold, and despite its high price tag, the value to Cohen wasn't at all financial. Regardless of its odd location coupled with his reluctance for promotion, people ordered from all over the country and paid handsomely for one of his ikebana displays. The art of flower arranging was a skill he had acquired from his time studying in Japan under Master Ueshiba. The displays had fortuitously become popular in some elite circles as the must-have centerpiece, an ignorance that bemused him, to culture the energy of harmony through a delicate balance of creation, only to be lost on its need for status. Although Nathan had done a good job of exploiting their exclusivity, commanding fees that varied from hundreds into the thousands, depending on the establishment or individual placing the order. He also told stories of the owner traveling to remote lands to discover and cultivate some of the rarest seeds, plants, and flowers in the world, all adding to the shop's mystery and charm, but for the most part it did a good job of covering Cohen's constant absence. He descended the stairs from his upstairs flat to a door that led into the rear of the shop's workspace. He was halfway down when the familiar smell of fresh coffee and freshly baked pastry pierced the sweet floral-scented air, fused with a distinct undertone of incense. Upon opening the door, he froze. Expecting to see Nathan sat at the workbench enjoying his breakfast and a newspaper, the way he did every morning before starting work, not an attractive blonde lady wearing one of his hooded sweat-tops. Cohen's eyes darted back and forth around the room, still hoping Nathan would appear to give an explanation as to who this woman was and why she was sitting in his shop, wearing his top. "Good morning," she said. Her voice was soft and carried the warmth of familiarity, giving her an advantage over Cohen's lack of memory from the last several hours. He aired with caution, continuing to look around, making sure they were alone. The shop was long and narrow, with a wider workspace and workbench at the rear, where she was sitting. Its location didn't allow much light to travel far inside, leaving the workspace in a constant and steady gloom. Unless the overhead fluorescent lights were on, it allowed anonymity, concealing you in silhouette. But from the bench you could see all who entered. Cohen navigated around the multitude of vases that cluttered most of the movable space and peered out of the shop window, looking up and down the street for anything that might appear out of place. Everything was quiet. Everything apart from the unanswered questions that were racing around his head. "Well, you certainly look better than you did a couple of hours ago," she continued. "To be honest, I didn't think anybody could bounce back quite so quickly, even you." Bounce back, he thought. While he knew he gave a relatively convincing appearance of functioning, the truth was he was still drunk and doing what he could to stave off a wicked hangover. Playing guess who wasn't exactly helping. When entering the room, he'd eyed a pastry bag and coffee invitingly laid out opposite the woman. She cradled her own drink, and from the disregarded paper bag riddled with flakes, it suggested the other bag was probably for him. He placed his arms locked and rigid onto the work surface and bared down upon his guest as though she were about to be the subject of interrogation. For most, it would have felt an intense and uncomfortable situation, but the attractive woman simply stared back with poise, her bright blue eyes never once breaking a gaze that held the warmth of her voice. She noticed scars on the back of Cohen's hands, some that continued up his strong forearms and biceps, not the wounds of a florist. She sipped her coffee and smiled with unsettling ease. Having failed to ruffle the feathers of his company, he petulantly took a seat opposite, tore open the pastry bag without invitation, ripping off almost half a croissant off with his teeth and poking the excess into his mouth with his fingers, never removing his eyes from her. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "You took quite a beating." Cohen just stared and chewed. "So, I guess that's the way you want to go, huh?" she continued. "Picking fights with people in the hope they might beat you to death. I suppose it is faster than alcohol. Do you even remember anything of last night?" He ripped off another section of croissant, continuing to stare. He didn't care what had happened last night, to him or to anyone else, only who she was and why she was here. "I wanted to take you to the hospital," she continued, nervously filling the silence. "But you insisted on coming here. Of course, I thought. A flower shop. Where else?" She looked around at the array of vases and flowers that exploded out of them like a snapshot of a fireworks display. and then back at Cohen as if she was having trouble visualizing the pairing. "It's very beautiful," she said. His blank and unwavering expression finally amused the woman to laughter. "You don't remember me, do you?" She wasn't talking about last night, and that's not what he was expecting. He quietly and frantically searched the recesses of his mind, desperately trying to place a situation or scenario where he might recognize her. There was a haze of familiarity, but his fragile head couldn't tell him any more than that. "I guess it has been a while. You really don't remember me, Jacqueline Gotha? Leanie?" she said, smiling broadly. It wasn't her name, but her smile that had jolted his memory. Her eyes twinkled as her face lit up, revealing the woman he'd met some years past, beautiful, untrustworthy, and, last he knew, married to one of the most powerful and dangerous men in London. He pursed his lips and nodded an acknowledgement. That was about as close to a smile as he'd ever give. "You never were one for talking," she said. Cohen just watched, although now he was cautiously alert, scrutinizing and analyzing details. At first glance, Leanie was a confident woman with poise, but a tiny tremor below the corner of her mouth revealed itself when she smiled, and her fingers nervously played with the plastic lid on her drink, unconsciously shredding its edges. She was more nervous than she was letting on. "Why are you here, Leanie?" She looked at him with the veil of reacquaintance lifted, hesitating before saying, "I need your help." He scoffed. "Please just hear me out. It's not what you think." "How did you even find me?" "Oh, you know," she said, trying to inject a light-hearted tone. "Dusted off some old phone numbers. Called in a few favors. They said that I was probably wasting my time, but—" "You are," he said, cutting her off. "I don't do that anymore." His bluntness flustered her and took a second to compose herself before continuing. "You know, I never did believe the rumors," she said, pausing to gauge his reaction, expecting at least a response of curiosity. But she got nothing but an ice-cold stare. "Until I saw you last night. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I didn't want to believe." "You should have listened," Cohen said with disregard, slurping his coffee and shoving the remainder of the croissant in his mouth. "Wasting everyone's time. How the mighty have fallen." She hit back. "Problem is, Cohen, I didn't find the man I was looking for. Instead, all I found was a pathetic drunk begging for it to all be over." Suddenly the English rose, withered. Now only thorns remained, but she had his attention. "You know they said you'd lost it. A kill too far finally broke you. But that's not it at all, is it? No, the person I saw last night wasn't crazy. Lost maybe, desperate but not crazy." He didn't have the head for this, and envisioned grabbing her by the arm, dragging her through the shop and slinging her out of the front door. But now she knew his location. He silently cursed himself for being so stupid. For years he'd managed to keep the shop a secret hidden in plain sight. Nathan Levinson was the name on the lease. Even the title of the deeds were a subsidiary of Ikebana Holdings, a company formed out of Japan. And in one drunken night he'd given up his location to a woman who had connections to every major scumbag in London's underworld. While he loved the location, he always knew he'd have to sell up at some point and move on. Now was as good a time as any. "I almost left you there," she continued. "And if it had been for any other reason, I would have. But it's my son." Her voice cracked slightly, but there was a steely resilience to her. "He's missing." Cohen's stare refused to soften, but he did now recognize the woman from his past, although she wasn't that woman. She was a mother now. He knew what was coming. Despite her best efforts, her theatre reeked of desperation, but more importantly, he just didn't care. He was in Prague on a school trip. "It's the first time he's been away without me. He's only 11. Josh is his name." As if simply retelling a story of his first outing, like the truth was somehow disconnected from reality. But he understood the need for self-preservation in the midst of a personal hell. She took a picture from her bag and slid it across the counter until it rested in front of Cohen. He allowed his eyes to flit momentarily, but was more concerned in watching Leanie. Regardless of her plight and his fragile state, caution hadn't yet left him. As long as he was sober or close to it, it remained his default position.